Hey everybody, welcome back to Run and Gun. I am JT, welcome to the channel if you are new here. And in this video, what we're gonna do is try and break down and recreate essentially a Polaroid or a vintage style from a Polaroid camera. And I just took this photo the other day and I posted it on my community. And just so you guys know, I do have a little community tab here on YouTube. I make some posts every now and then with new photos that don't always make it into my videos, or I'll give you guys an update on a new video that's coming. So what I have here is I have a Polaroid image that I shot on my little Polaroid One Step Express. And in order to recreate this, what I did was I shot the same scene, same lighting, same everything on my Nikon Z6. So what I wanted to do was essentially take all of the colors from this and recreate them in this image. And my thought process is once I recreate the colors with adjustment layers for this image, I should be able to take them over and drop them in this little fake Polaroid frame that I made. And I got a couple little images here to test it on, and we'll come back to this at the end of the video and see how this actually worked out. So here's my Polaroid frame. And you can see if we study this image for a little bit, our reds in this image get nice and bright and desaturated. Our oranges are still pretty saturated. They're a little bit darker. Our blues are very dark. And I threw this gray card in here just so we could kind of have a middle 50% gray to really see what our midtones are doing. So let's get started here. What I did was I created a color palette, and if I zoom out, you can see this whole color palette going all the way from some of my brightest colors in the image to my darkest colors in the image, and some of the key oranges, yellows, blues, greens, etc. that we get into in this image that we want to make match up in this image over here. So here's my color palette, super easy to create. All I did in here, these are a bunch of tiny little squares, nothing complicated. And if you don't know how to create those, what I did was I created a new layer. I sampled a certain part or a certain color in this image. So let's go up here on this little monitor, select that orange, create a little block, hold shift to make it a perfect square, let go of your mouse, let go of shift, and then I can hit Alt Delete or Alt Backspace and Command D to deselect. And then I can just move this square into my color palette. As you can see, I sampled an almost identical color already over here. So that's how I created this little color palette. I threw it in a group, renamed it palette, just so it's easier to turn all those layers on and off. And if we start looking at this image, again, you can see some of my brightest colors that I sampled here have a little tint of pink or red, and they're pretty gray. They're kind of clipped. And you can see here it clipped some of the overexposed white values. Some of my darker values end up being a very dark green. They're not quite black. They're not quite gray. They're a very dark green. You can see I sampled my green from right around in here. I sampled my mid-tone grays, which are pretty greenish right here. So you can see the trend of this Polaroid 600 or Polaroid Originals 600 film tends to be kind of greenish in the shadows and midtones and kind of a pinkish, yellowish, warm interestingness. So let's take our palette and bring it over into our frame here. So we'll turn on our color palette. And what I did also was I actually brought my Polaroid frame, which I shot on my Z6. Let's actually name this Polaroid Original. If I can spell here today, original frame, just so we know exactly what that layer is. And I can bring this around and I can actually sample colors from this Polaroid frame so I can make sure they're matching up here. So I'm going to turn this off because we kind of already did that with our color palette right here. So now I can go in here and I can see here are all of our adjustment layers, and I threw them in a group. So what you're going to start off with is you're going to start off by clicking this little folder down here and create a new group. And all of your edits are going to go into this group so that you can drag and drop them on other images in the future. So we already have our Polaroid colors group made, and let's take a look and see what that actually looks like so you guys know that I'm not messing with you and I actually went through and I did this. So here is our final look that we did. We're going to break down every step in the process of recreating it. and here is our Polaroid. So pretty darn close. And this was a pretty technical process. It actually took me a couple days to make. But let's break down all of these layers. So what we're going to do is we're going to shut off our original frame, and we're going to keep our palette on here. And notice our palette is above our edits, because if you had your palette underneath, you'd be making edits to your palette, and you want your palette to stay the same as your original Polaroid image. So let's keep our palette on, and let's go through our Polaroid colors group and see all of the edits are made. So let's start from the beginning. We'll shut all of these off, and the first thing I did was I messed with the hues. So what I did was I created a new hue and saturation adjustment layer. So you can either go into your layer, new adjustment layer, and hue and saturation, or if you have your adjustments tab open, this little one that almost looks like a film slate is your hue and saturation adjustment. So create a new one of those layers. This will pop up, and I went through all of these individual colors. I started with red, and you can see here I desaturated the red and I brought up the brightness quite a bit. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to match these colors right here. You can see I matched the red pretty closely. It looks like it is a touch darker. That looks a lot closer. And if you want to make this a lot easier, you can take your palette and you can bring your palette right next to what you're trying to edit here, so you're not trying to look all the way across the screen to compare colors. So what we're trying to do in this initial hue and saturation layer, and you can see I started off with the red, then I went to my yellows and oranges. You can see I edited kind of both of those together, made my oranges match pretty close, made my yellows match pretty close. Right now you're trying to just get as close as possible, and this isn't always exact. It's always kind of guesswork, and you're going to come back and you're going to edit these later. Again, here are my greens. What I did is I brought up the saturation, brought down the lightness. In my yellows, I brought up the saturation, brought up the lightness, almost clipped those yellows because that's what Polaroids tend to do. I didn't do much with the cyans because there weren't many in here, but they were quite similar to blue. Polaroid tends to darken your blues, shift them towards more of a purple or dark blue, and bumps up that saturation. You can see in my blues here, I adjusted, bring them towards purple a little bit. In the hue, take my saturation, really bump up that saturation, and you can see start to match those blues up and darken them up a bit. I don't want to go too far towards the purple. Maybe they're just kind of a very deep blue. So that is a good start. We're not quite there, but we also have a lot of other layers and a lot of other things that we can do. So let's turn on our curves layer, and you could see this starts to really darken up our image, and we're starting to get a little bit closer to our Polaroid frame. So to create a new curves layer, you can either, in your adjustments, hit this little curve symbol right there, or go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. So in our curves layer, what we did, if I bring it over here, so in our curves layer, you can see we made a nice S-curve where we clipped our highlights and lifted our shadows. So if we reset this, what I did is I clicked our blacks, lifted up our blacks, because again, in our Polaroid, our blacks are very kind of mushy and lifted, and our highlights are a little bit faded. So you can see we put a nice fade on our image, but there was some contrast in there. So I'll make another point, bring down our shadows, and then bring up our highlights just a touch. So the maximum our highlights can be are kind of a light gray. I'll bring these up just a little bit more because again, there was some contrast in that image. It was just kind of difficult to see. So there's our Polaroid. We're getting kind of close with the contrast. I like it. So let's close our curves layer and let's open up color balance. And we'll turn on our color balance. And this is where I started to add some of those funky colors that the Polaroid reproduces. So if we turn this off and turn it on, here's where I really had some fun matching up these colors. I usually like to start with the shadows and work my way to the highlights. And here I added a little bit of red, some green, and some blue. I might take that red back a little bit. I had to balance out some of the green in there, so I did have to add a little bit of red, even though our shadows are very green. And sometimes I like to go a little overboard with this effect, and that way I can always turn it down. Maybe I do a holistic global opacity where I turn it down, or I come back in here and do minor adjustments. So you can see I made our shadows very green, and then next step I moved on to our midtones, which I added some yellow, I added some red, and added a little bit of green. So in additive color space, green and red make yellow, so I just bumped up those a little bit, turned down the magenta, turned down the cyan, and you can see I warmed up our midtones quite a bit. Then I moved on up to our highlights, which you can see in our highlights had a strange magenta cyan warmth to them. And again, I had to mimic our original Polaroid frame in our palette. So if I take our palette and drag it over, you can start to see these brighter areas of the image start to match up with our color balanced adjustment layer here. So we can close that on out. That was color balance. So far, here is our original, and here is our edit so far with mimicking our Polaroid. So one of my tips and tricks that I like to do is if I'm going to be doing a lot of things with curves, I might make a second curves layer instead of trying to do it all with one curves layer. So that's what I did here, is I clipped our highlights even more with this curves layer. So we'll turn this on, and you can see our highlights went to a very bright white to more of a gray. It clipped some of our yellows that were very bright, clipped some of our reds, and you can see in the Polaroid, the brightest color in here is kind of a gray, kind of a light, or a darker white, excuse me. So we'll turn that off, and here we're getting closer to that gray. And I lifted the shadows even more, and you can see with this S-curve, I brought down our whites, brought up our blacks, and really clipped the highlights and the shadows. So once again, one little step, we're getting closer. And what I also did, I noticed this was still very saturated. So I desaturated the entire frame, and now you can see we made a big jump towards our color palette here. You can see our greens are pretty darn close, almost matching up. Our blues, again, are really close. They look pretty good when it comes to the actual hue themselves. Our reds look pretty darn good. I think I sampled the top right here, that darker red, and our oranges are looking pretty nice. So let's look at our midtones. Our midtones look dead on. That looks great. Sampled directly again from our Polaroid. Our shadows, let's find a dark shadowy area on the screen. That looks pretty darn good, maybe a little bit darker. And let's see, some more of our midtones look pretty good. And lastly, let's check our highlights. I think our highlights look pretty good. So we'll drag our color palette over back to the corner, get it out of our way. I'm going to shut that off real quick. That's looking pretty good so far. We're looking pretty darn close to our Polaroid image. And one last thing I did is I turned down the brightness, crushed the dynamic range, and I did that with levels. I lowered the output and I tightened up our input here a little bit. And again, you can make a new adjustment layer by going to levels right here on the right hand side, or layer, new adjustment layer, levels. So levels was a pretty simple adjustment. Again, just crush our highlights, crushed our shadows a little bit, and I might actually go in and do some more very minor editing to our levels. Kind of crush the output a little bit, clip some of our shadows. That looks much better. Maybe clip some of our highlights a touch. I think that looks pretty good. So we can see all of our things here, and if we do a quick review, we did a hue and saturation adjustment layer to adjust individual colors. We clipped our highlights and adjusted our shadows with a curves layer. Then we went into color balance and made some highlights, some midtone, and some shadow adjustments. We made another curves layer to clip our highlights even more and lift our shadows even more, and add a little bit of contrast in there with a very subtle S-curve. Fade the image a little bit more. We realized that our hue and saturation was very saturated, so we brought down our saturation quite a bit, down to about -40 right there. And then we crushed our dynamic range a little bit with curves, darkened up the image a little bit, and that is our holistic Polaroid colors look. So there's our before. You can see a massive difference now, and our after. So we're pretty darn close with our color palette. Blues look good, highlights look good, shadows look good, orange, green, yellow, all of that looks pretty good. And now if we bring up our image next to it, that looks pretty darn close. And again, this is all a matter of what you want it to look like. You can make some stylistic adjustments, and you can make, let's select our Polaroid frame, just kind of move it around. You can see our midtones match, our shadows match pretty well. Our pinkish warm highlights match pretty well. And it's kind of hard. There's a lot of chromatic aberration, and I'm using a cheap plastic lens with that Polaroid, so your light is always going to be a little bit messed up, and all of these are going to be slightly different depending on your lighting. But I tried to use similar indoor artificial lighting, and when I shot this image, I tried to white balance from my gray card here, and when I recreated this Polaroid, or I duplicated it using my Nikon Z6, same camera that I shot this with, I white balanced using this white frame here, so I was making sure that my replica was properly white balanced to what my eye would see if I were just looking at this Polaroid and holding it up to my screen. So let's shut that off, and I think this looks pretty darn good. Let's give this a test on our test frame over here. So we had our original Polaroid frame, and again, we made this test frame. I just made, I believe, an 8x10 or a 4x5 frame here. I made this little Polaroid guy right here with a thin top, thin sides, and a very thick bottom where you can write your caption down here on the bottom. And then I also made this vignette because you can see in here a nice vignette going around the edge. If I shut off this palette, the inside of this image is much brighter than these edges over here. And if you see this image, the frame itself was completely flat when it comes to lighting. So this vignette was caused by the camera itself. So I added a nice vignette. And if you don't know how to do that, you can create a new layer, set it to overlay. So new layer, set that layer, the blend mode to overlay right there, and take your gradient tool, make sure it's set over here to black and white, and then make sure your gradient goes from black to transparent. And then all you have to do is start clicking and dragging, and you will start to make a vignette here in your image. So you can see I already did that. I kind of went in a circle. I really emphasized the corners here, so I'm going to get rid of this layer. And let's turn on a couple different layers that I wanted to mess with. So I brought over our Polaroid color edit here, and let's turn on, this is an actual image of the Polaroid One Step Express itself in the woods. And let's turn on our Polaroid, and that looks pretty close to what an actual Polaroid of this would look like. And I can turn down the global opacity of this group right here, and I can kind of go in and tweak how much of the detail, because the Polaroid really loses quite a bit of detail in the dark shadows. And this was a dark area right here in the shadows. There's some dark shadows over here. Our heavy vignette made it even darker. So these details down here in a Polaroid would be lost. Our highlights over here would be clipped. Polaroids actually replicate, from my experience, greens pretty well. You can see in our Fujifilm box right here, these greens look pretty good. There's actually, looks like a lot of range in these greens, and blue isn't too bad. It just gets darkened and a little oversaturated. So we have our blues and our sky here that were darkened and oversaturated, but our greens, our browns, our reds look pretty good. So again, a before and an after, once again shot on my Z6. And let's try another shot. You guys might recognize this image from my Lomo Chrome recreation attempt, and we'll turn that Polaroid on, and I think that looks pretty awesome. Again, our reds were brightened up a little bit, kind of desaturated. You can see our blues darkened up quite a bit. Our browns got a little bit mushy, and you can see there's this nice right here kind of darkish reddishness from our overlay vignette layer. I think that looks pretty good. And as always, there are little minor things you can do. If this wasn't faded enough for you, again, we can really crank the opacity. That looks even better. You can always fade your image more with another curves layer if you want to. So let's say I thought this image looked a little too contrasty. I can always go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves, hit OK. We can bring down our highlights even more, bring up our shadows even more, and again, it's all a matter of taste and minor adjustments. There's the before and the after. I actually really like that. We're really crushing our highlights even more and mushing our shadows together even more. And it doesn't look so great on this image. I might shut it off, but Again, it's little edits to taste. When you take a preset, essentially what we made here, and you slap it on any image, it's always going to react a little bit different depending on the hues, the brightness of every image that you shoot. So again, what you're going to want to make sure you do is before you even start the process, make sure this image is properly white balanced. And before you start adding your looks or your edits to any image, make sure they are properly white balanced. That way you're getting an accurate recreation of your color palette and your preset. So that's about it. One last thing that I might do to make this look a lot like a Polaroid is I'll go into our original layer right here. I'll hit Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I'll add a blur depending on how close or far you are, somewhere between roughly 3 and 5. Hit OK, and then I'll go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise. That's a little bit much. Usually go Gaussian. Sometimes monochromatic looks pretty good. I like the color in there though. And let's change the amount to 5%. Hit OK. And that actually looks quite a bit like a Polaroid. Make sure you do your noise after your blur because there is a loss of detail because that lens on your Polaroid camera isn't very sharp. So if we go over here, we look at our Polaroid, you can see in here there is some little speckles of noise, and I can't quite read this text like I can in this image because obviously our Z6 with a 50mm lens is super sharp. But here we have, it's kind of our sharpness is blurred a little bit, and there is some little speckles of noise. So we did the same thing kind of here. You can still see that there was some detail in our image. It's blurred a little bit, and there is some noise on top of it. So I think that looks pretty good. If we were to recreate this, I'm going to turn down the effect a little bit on our camera. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Looks pretty good. I'm going to turn it down to 3, hit OK, filter, noise, add noise, 5%. Looks good. So if I get in here, there is some detail in the noise, but you lose some of the detail in the sharpness of the image. And I think that looks pretty close to an actual Polaroid. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you got something out of it. Again, you can do this process yourself, or I might make this little Polaroid layer into a LUT and put it up on my website pretty soon. So keep an eye out for that. If I do that, you can either download it from my website or just follow this tutorial or recreate Polaroids based on actual Polaroids that you shot. So that's all for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you got something, definitely hit that like button. Be sure to share with your friends if they enjoy Polaroids and that vintage Polaroid style. And of course, hit that subscribe and notification button so you're getting all of my videos. So I will see you guys next weekend. And until next time, get out and go shoot.